Hello friends, and welcome to another Sunday Weekly Waffle, the show where we ramble about a topic and then ask a question for you, the audience, to get involved and chat in the comments with me and about whatever subject we've spoken about that week. And this week's subject is an interesting one because it comes from a viewer. We're going to talk about the topic of positivity. Now, this was an interesting one for me to take and to field, and I was a little bit apprehensive about doing this at first because I think positivity is a story of two sides, and I think it's really important to discuss both of them. The first one, and you may not be familiar with this term, but you may also, thanks to the work of some amazing YouTubers such as Discourse Miniatures, and just general article writers at the moment and the like, you may be aware of the term toxic positivity. I know I read an extensive article on this quite recently. If I can find that article, I will link it down below, but don't be surprised if it's not there because it was a late night mobile phone read. So I'm not quite sure if I'll be able to retrace my footsteps and find it, but I'll try. Anyway, not the point. Toxic positivity essentially is the assertion that any kind of negative criticism of something is just shitting on other people's fun, and it's treated as if that's the only thing it brings to the table. And I am simplifying here. You'll have to forgive me for simplifying, but we do only have 15 minutes for these videos, and I like to try and keep them under that if I can. And so the idea is that if you criticize something in any way other than to be hype about it, to be excited about it, to reinforce it, if you discuss it in any other context than that, the only thing you're bringing to the table is that you're ruining other people's fun, or that you're making it a drag, or that you're talking down on the hobby, and this is problematic for a couple of reasons. A lot of the criticism that companies take is from people who are extremely passionate about the hobby, such as myself. I'm not the only one out there by any means that is willing to say it both ways, but it's almost always, in my experience, the majority at least, of people who criticise are doing so because they really care and they want to see the best version of the hobby for everyone that engages with it. Now, where that becomes a bit of a problem is that, certain companies, certain games, certain business practices, certain ways of doing things are so expanded now, they're so popular, they're so wide-reaching that they're considered normal, and because people consider these things normal, they consider anyone whom they don't sit right to be just kind of acting up, which is a bit of an issue. Now, there are going to be some people who are just acting up. Of course there are. There are going to be some people who are mad about a specific thing, or, they're acting purely on their own irritation, upset and anger. Of course that's going to be a thing. But there's also going to be a lot of people who, when they criticise, when they talk negatively about certain aspects of the hobby, they're doing it with good intent. And I would like to believe it's clear, but just in case it isn't, I'm definitely in that latter camp. I do criticise miniatures companies, and I do criticise game systems and hobby companies. One of the companies I've given quite a hard time to recently is Games Workshop. Why do I do that? If this video is about positivity, if that's the discussion, where is there room for that to exist in a world of positivity? And the problem is, and this is where I think it's important to discuss this side of positivity, is that with a company like Games Workshop, they have such a broad reach and such a loud voice, and so many fans who will just constantly sing their praises regardless, who will just forever be in their corner no matter what they do. The voices of dissent can be drowned out, and sometimes they have really important things to say. When people are talking about how Games Workshop's business practices aren't normal, they're not saying that there's no precedent for them. They're saying that in the hobby space, this company that's supposed to be the industry leader is leading through predatory means. They're leading through methods that in larger other industries have proven to work for extracting the maximum amount of money out of people. And so when people criticise Games Workshop's business practices, it's not that they're trying to say it's not normal at all, or that it never happens at all, and that GW are the only bad guy in this situation. They're saying this wonderful hobby that we all share is being reshaped by these extremely predatory business practices from outside of the hobby, and they're being brought in, and because it's the largest, loudest, widest reaching voice in the industry that's doing this, people start to think it's normal and become desensitized to it. And this is something GW has a history of doing, audience conditioning, making their audience believe things are normal that are in fact not normal. A great example of this was how Forge World was originally marketed, and how having to work bubbles out of resin and having to saw off huge gates and having to rework mold slips with milliput and all that kind of thing. When Forge World was first being marketed to the masses by GW, these things were, we were told, normal. This was just a part of the material, and in exchange for this extra hard work, you got this beautiful, much crisper sculpt. That's not the case. We now know that because we're so many years past that point now that we've seen a bunch of stuff from other smaller companies in resin that doesn't share all of these flaws. Or if it does, they're removed at QC before they're sent out to the customer. And that was something that I spoke about recently in a video. In fact, it was in a weekly waffle. We were talking about cast resin and if it still had a place in the industry. And it does, of course it has a place in the industry, but it also serves as a good example here of how Games Workshop will condition their audience to think that things are normal when they're not. Paying, what is it? Like, let me just look this up. I'll edit this bit out. So yeah, I just wanted to check up some prices on the Games Workshop website before I started talking about this, but paying inflated amounts for models that you're going to buy fewer of, and smaller amounts per model for models that you're going to buy more of, that has always been justified to us by what the character models are more detailed. But that's clearly not the reason, because they're not. Games Workshop have kind of reached a point with their design now where the models are as detailed or not detailed as they want to make them. There is no specialness, that's a terrible use of a word, but there is nothing special about a character model anymore. A character model is exactly the same as any other model in their line in terms of how much detail it has. The sculpts are often more complex with character models. They often have more individual components to add to the sculpt than a non-character version of that model might have, such as a Space Marine captain versus a Space Marine in whatever same type of armour. But they're not more detailed, they just usually have a couple of extra bits in the kit. And so, you know, it doesn't make sense that it's like 25 quid for one Space Marine with a couple of extra bits in the kit versus 35 quid for 10 Space Marines, which on the general grand scale of the hobby is actually still quite expensive anyway. 35 quid for 10 multi-part models is in the upper end of pricing anyway. But 25 quid for a single model when it's just got, you know, an extra bit of plastic on its base, maybe an extra sword, couple of extra bits of detail on the shoulder pads or whatever, is ridiculous. But Games Workshop has conditioned the audience to automatically in their heads say, you know, detail equals more cost, which is just not true. And so these are examples, and I'm being specific with the Games Workshop thing for exactly the reason that it's important to criticise them in the first place, because they are the loudest, widest reaching voice. And so, you know, by using them as an example, it's something that everyone can relate to, because pretty much everyone has some experience dealing with them. But here's the thing, when people are criticising this stuff, it's really important to understand where they're coming from. For me, it's about a couple of things. Consumer advocacy is very important to me and always has been. I have failed as a business person on several occasions in my life because I value consumer advocacy too high, and I'm not willing to do things in business that, although would make me money, would sacrifice how well I'm treating my customers. That's been a problem for me in the past. I've always lived by that code. Customers are very important to me. And So consumer advocacy is very important to me. So often when I'm criticising Games Workshop, it's from a point of view of, I want people to be informed that other options exist, that they don't have to accept being treated a certain way. But at the same time, there's always the caveat of, but of course, if all of this is fine for you, enjoy it, go and have fun with it. The point of saying these things is to provide a reference of information, not to tell you what you can and can't do. And that's where a lot of the issue comes in, is that in a world where you're expected to always be positive, which is very much what Games Workshop puts out to their audience. It's always positive, positive, positive. It's why it takes them so long to release, an anti-hate speech, an anti-hate behaviour statement. I think is probably because they're trying to figure out what's the way that they can do it that's going to least be a downer to the audience. But when that's the way you put things out into the world, that's the way you behave, you end up in a situation where trying to do good and provide information is only seen as a source of contention to that. And it isn't. Criticism of large corporations whose practices affect a lot of people is supposed to be an important way through which customers can be informed, and then they inform the company through their purchasing decisions. And this ties into another point that was brought to me recently about why boycotts don't work, and that's because companies don't look at the data of what they don't sell. They look at the data of what they do sell. If you want to change the direction a company is taking, buy the things that you feel represent them doing it right, and don't buy the things that you feel represent them doing it wrong. Because a lack of data is not something they're going to use to change direction. If they see an overall decline in sales, that's certainly something that they might look at. But on an individual micro level, you are not going to make changes by doing that. And so it's important to understand that that's one of the main reasons why boycotts don't work. And that's why I was never on the side of the Games Workshop boycotts when they were a thing we were talking about. But because we have to challenge this culture of reinforced toxic positivity before we can understand that criticism and negativity are not necessarily equals, they're not necessarily the same thing, it's very hard to have a voice in that conversation. And this is why specifically the Warhammer community is so divided now, is because the toxic positivity behaviour that Games Workshop encourages and that its community naturally falls into creates a paradigm in which anyone who isn't on their side is against them. And that isn't how the real world works. In the real world, if you like a different football team to your friend, you could still be friends, right? And there are people who will have punch-ups, fist fights, and actually seriously hurt each other over football. But most football fans understand that what team someone supports has no reflection on who they are as a person. And much in the same way, if we remove ourselves from this personal attachment that we make to the hobby for a moment, if we can just step back from that for a moment, it can be easy to see that people who like different games aren't necessarily enemies or against us or in some way a problem to the hobby. They're just people who like different things. And it's important in life that everyone gets a voice, except for people who spread hate. Those people don't get a voice, in my opinion. Yours may differ, but you'd be wrong. It's important that people get a voice because when you express, I personally don't think Games Workshop are worthy of my support at the moment because they seem more interested in my money than in me enjoying their game. Somebody else might have been feeling that way but struggled to articulate it. Somebody else might have been having a real problem where they're trying to come to that decision, but because they're surrounded by toxic positivity, they don't feel like they can express that. They don't feel like they can be that person because they feel like all of their friends will just ridicule them and say, no, don't be stupid. Games Workshop have always been around. This is how they are, shut up and play some 40k, buy another box of Space Marines. We have to be really careful to not drown out these voices. They may not be the majority, but they are still people with worthy thoughts and opinions. And so positivity to me, it's much more about challenging toxic positivity Because I think genuine positivity, the expression of a passion and a love for something, that comes out in everything we do as hobbyists. Every time I paint a miniature and I think I've done a really good job, it's because I was passionate about that project. Every time I play a game and have a great time, it's because playing that game is my passion. Every time I talk about the hobby with other people, whether the conversation is about positive or negative topics, I'm being passionate and I'm expressing my love for the hobby. And that is positive, always. Because if we didn't have people who love the hobby, there would be nothing positive to enjoy. The hobby is built on the people who love it. And so I guess my question to you, as we finally get to the end of the waffle, is what do you think is more important? Continuing in the current paradigm of toxic positivity, or establishing more of a new world order, shall we say, where voices of dissent are not automatically labelled as negative? Moreover, which camp are you in personally? Would you rather people just shut up about anything that isn't positive on an external level, just get on with playing their games and enjoy themselves? Or would you prefer that people were allowed to be taken more seriously if their opinion isn't necessarily the same as the majority? Do you think that sometimes we should be listening to those people? I have a feeling with the way my audience leans that probably quite a lot of you will be in the same camp as me, where you think that dissent is a good thing and it shows an expression of passion and positivity, even when it's not necessarily a topic that is easy to talk about or that makes people happy to hear spoken about. But I do think it's really interesting to get all opinions, and I do think it's really interesting that everyone gets a voice, and I can't say that without also offering a voice to people who disagree with me. So get your comments below, folks. That's this week's discussion. I think it'll be a good one. Remember to keep it healthy, keep it respectful, be nice to each other. That's always the most important thing. Just be decent human beings to each other, because we all deserve that. And yeah, if you want to support me, as usual, there's links below in the description. My wonderful sponsors, Lazy Dragon Gaming, we're still waiting for a few update bits for it, but they have just launched a new website. That's banging. There's a link to that in the description. My Patreon is in the description. My affiliate links are in the description. You know what to do. Fill your boots. Go nuts. Thank you so much for watching, folks. I hope you enjoyed this week's Weekly Waffle. I will see you with the main video on Wednesday of next week. Bye-bye for now.